Hi, my name is Cassie Addai. I am a third year trainee clinical psychologist at the University of East London. I think for me, the reasons that I've been interested in clinical psychology as a career have definitely changed over time. When I first started studying psychology at A level, it was definitely about working with people. And I think that that's how I came into psychology, whereas previously I've been thinking about wanting to be a doctor and wanting to study medicine. But as soon as I started studying psychology at A level, the idea of working with people more psychologically, more therapeutically, really drew me in. And then I think as time has gone on, as I studied at undergraduate, it became more about working with people in a very particular way. So the ideas of therapy, the ideas of formulation, perhaps rather than being so much about medication, about diagnosis, I think those ideas have really influenced my decision to train as a clinical psychologist. And yeah, I think the variety in the role, the fact that every day is different, every service that you might work in is different in terms of the age of people, from children, young people, even babies and perinatal services, right through to the other spectrum of the age range. And yeah, working with groups, working with families, couples, doing some research. I think that variety has definitely appealed to me too. So my advice in terms of getting relevant work experience would be to start early. For me, my work experience started when I was about 14, 15. I began volunteering with Rainbows, so they're the youngest age group of Girl Guiding. And that was a really good experience in terms of working with people, working with children. It was actually really fun. Like most weeks, I was just playing, reading them stories, hearing about the stuff that they've been up to. But I think that experience was then a bit of a springboard. So by the time I was at university and looking for part-time work, I was then able to use that experience to get into things like paid work, play schemes for children with autism, Asperger's, and from that work at play schemes, I then started to do a bit of support work, again with children with autism and Asperger's, but also with adults who had mental health difficulties. So I think, yeah, that starting early volunteering then enabled me to get paid work experience when I was at university. And I think from then I've kind of been able to weave a bit of a path and think about the areas that I'm interested in, but also to build up skills that I think have been relevant in terms of applying for, then interviewing and eventually getting a place on clinical training. And another top tip that I found helpful to bear in mind for gaining work experience is that there's more than one path to training as a clinical psychologist. I think that for me, where my experience has perhaps been more traditional in terms of volunteering, support worker, CBT therapist staff, assistant psychologist, I am now in a cohort with 30 other people who have such varied and really interesting experience. So there are people who didn't study psychology at undergraduate, did a conversion course, haven't worked in the NHS, haven't worked as assistant psychologists. They have a far stronger research grounding than I have. So I think that would be, an important thing to bear in mind for anyone who's considering this career, is that you don't have to do one set thing, because that uniqueness in your experience and in your skills is what I think courses are looking for. So in thinking about this, I think what was helpful for me was to reflect on my two applications. So my first unsuccessful application, I think my don'ts were that I maybe tried too hard to inject my personality into the application form, and in doing so, I didn't answer the question. So yeah, I would say that's a bit of a don't. Just because I perhaps put so much pressure on myself to stand out in a sea of what I knew would be thousands of other applicants who had great experience, relevant experience. I didn't really answer the question. I was just I think trying to offer something that was maybe a little bit different. And so I think that then flips over to the do of making sure that you answer the question. I think in my second application, I was a lot better prepared. I had a lot better understanding of what a trainee clinical psychologist does and about how my experience relates to that. So I even went as far as kind of sitting there with the trainee clinical psychologist job description and went through just looking at, okay, what is it that I'm doing? What is it that I've done? And how does that meet each of these different areas? And of course, there were areas that I didn't have any experience or that I still had room for development. My experience has always been more clinical than it has been research. So it was good to identify those gaps and then think about actually, why is it that I want to do training? Well, because I want to develop those doctorate research skills. So even if you maybe don't, in your own mind score as highly on particular areas, I think to try not to let that hold you back in your application and, maybe spin that into a positive. So yeah, generally, I think making sure that you answer the question, making sure that you sell yourself as well. I think that's really important. Try not to do the job of the marker for them in terms of kind of doing yourself down or questioning, is this relevant? Is it not? I think that sometimes we can be really self-critical, and that comes across in your, people's applications where they maybe say, oh, I've done a bit of work in this area, or, I've done some work in that area. And actually, if you've done work in that area, you've done work in that area. You don't need to undersell it or underplay it. But actually, it should be more about, bolstering, not lying, bolstering your contribution in different areas and reflecting on the skills that you've gained through those roles. Another do that I found helpful was that in between my first and my second application, I had a Word document that I added to, in the sense of it being a bit like a reflective diary. So I would note down any achievements that I was proud of in my role as an assistant, or any things that I was doing outside of my paid work, because I think often we get really fixed in what are we doing in our 9 to 5, but actually there might be hobbies that you're involved in, or for me, I was involved in a group for aspiring assistant psychologists and pre-training psychologists. So I think had I not used the reflective document, I maybe wouldn't have had those skills and achievements in the forefront of my mind when it came to applying. So just having a space, whether it's electronically or by hand, to reflect on things that come up during the course of the year or in the months preceding your application. And I think that then you kind of have a few paragraphs or a few sentences, a few ideas that are there for the editing when it comes to actually writing your application. Whereas for me, I think that second time round, had I just been staring at that form with its tiny boxes and restricted word limits, I would have been overwhelmed. So I think that, that reflective diary process really helped me. I think for me, one of the major do's was to try and get across my personality, the fact that I'm a human being who is really interested in working with and alongside people. And I guess I saw the interview as an opportunity to do that, whereas the application, obviously being pen and paper, felt a bit more like a box ticking exercise in terms of, indicating that I do have these skills. I do have these competencies. The interview was a bit more of an opportunity to sell who I am as an individual and why I think that I'm ready for training. I think that with that in mind, I also would advise when you're going to interviews to think about the match between you and the course, the match between you and the teaching staff, the lecturers in that course as well. I guess one thing that I maybe is relevant to the application is to think about what the ethos of the course is, how that matches who you are and how you want to train, because the way I see it is that at the end of the day, we will all be qualifying as clinical psychologists at the end of the 3-year programme, but how I might practice, the values that I might hold might be slightly different from people who have trained a different course. They might very well be different from people that I trained alongside at UEL, but I imagine that there are differences. So for me, being at the interview was kind of a real life opportunity to be like, this is who I am, this is what I would bring to the profession, but also to kind of sit back and engage in that dialogue where I was thinking about what is it that you can offer me and how are you going to help me in the training and in kind of my journey to being the clinical psychologist that I want to be. I think that considering it as a dialogue, as a conversation, definitely helped me take the pressure off the interview. I was, of course, still incredibly nervous, but I think going into it like, okay, I'm going to think about you and whether I want to be here. Helped just to redress that power balance a little bit. I think for me, a major don't was don't be afraid to be human. So the way that I kind of embodied that was little things like saying, oh, that's an interesting question. I've not thought about that before. Or, even just saying to them, yeah, I'm really nervous. And just trying to slow things down. I think that sometimes in any interview situation, there can be that pressure to perform and to say the right question perfectly. But actually, you'd hope that as psychologists, they appreciate that you're nervous and that you really want to do as well as possible. So I think those kind of comments can help remind them of that it is nerve-wracking. You're trying your best. Maybe you have forgotten what the question was, or maybe you've gone off on a bit of a tangent, and that's okay. I guess another do that I found really helpful was to practice interviews beforehand. So I practiced with clinical psychologists in my team who were really lovely, really supportive. That was incredibly nerve-wracking though. I think mock interviews with people that you know, and like when you freeze, it's really embarrassing because you still have to work with them and see them. Whereas actually, I think the idea of freezing an interview with people that I didn't know and wouldn't see again felt less intimidating to me. And even when I wasn't practicing with people, I would also just do things like mock interviews where I would record myself in the voice notes of my phone, just so that I could hear myself back and think about, actually, did I answer that question? Was that concise enough? Was it too rambly? How do I shape that anecdote? So another way that I found helpful to structure my answers was the STAR acronym. So it's something that you might have heard of already, but STAR stands for situation, task, action, and results. Although I kind of think about the R as results or reflection. So when you're answering a question, maybe about what you did in a particular situation, obviously you need to say what the situation was, what your role was within that, but thinking about what was the outcome, what were the results, and what would you maybe have done differently. So that's maybe an opportunity for reflection. I did X, but now in this position I might do Y instead, and what I learned from that is Z. So I think that just having that in mind really helped me to make sure that I was giving enough description, enough kind of analysis, and enough reflection. One obstacle that I faced, I think something that I was aware of at the time and that I've also noticed looking back, is that there was so much discourse around how competitive training as a clinical psychologist is. And we had a lot of sessions, a lot of lectures from clinical psychologists, from academics, particularly at undergraduate, where people were saying, like, the odds are 100 to 1, basically. You're never going to get onto training. You should be thinking about plan B. And I think it was difficult for me then to know, okay, how difficult is this thing? And how likely is it that I will be able to achieve it? I remember one particular incident where I was on the train and I had my psychology textbooks, and a man who sat opposite me looked over, saw that I was reading a psychology textbook and said, "You're a psychology student?" I was like, "Yeah." It's like, "So you must want to do clinical." "Yeah, I do." And he basically said, don't do it. It's so competitive. It's impossible. It's a complete waste of your time. You're never going to get on. And I still think about that interaction. I think that at the time I was kind of so taken aback by this complete stranger telling me what I should and shouldn't be doing with my career that I didn't really know how to respond to it. And I think now the advice that I try and give to other people is that yes, it's competitive. Yes, there are so many more people who are who are applying and who would be great, who have all of the relevant skills and experience, then there are places. And that doesn't mean that it's impossible. People do get places. People like me who are no more intelligent or skilled or worthy of those places than anyone else who has, the same or similar experience. So I think that was definitely an obstacle for me. And with that in mind, I think you do start to doubt yourself and wonder, is this going to happen for me? Am I just chasing this ridiculous pipe dream that will never happen? Should I even bother applying? Should I be, looking at something else? And I think that managing those thoughts is difficult. And it did, for a period, I think, weigh on my mind and make me think that actually I wasn't good enough, that the course was too competitive, and that I wouldn't get to where I am. And it's funny because, as I said, I do still think about that conversation with that man on the train, and I kind of wish that I could be like, look at me now, you said that I wasn't going to do it. And if I'd listened to him, then I wouldn't be here, right? I don't know what I'd be doing, actually. I don't really think I had a plan B. But yeah, I guess just to offer some words of encouragement to anyone else who's hearing those messages and thinking, yeah, can I do this? If it's something that you want, hopefully, there'll be a place for you. I think following on from the last question about the obstacles, because of the narrative of applying for the DClinPsy training as it being so competitive, I kind of thought that was the hard part, and I perhaps naively didn't really appreciate how challenging I would find training. And I think that comes for many different reasons. A big part of it is probably that I moved cities to start training, and that was because for me, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of training at a course program that had a similar ethos to my own values was really important to me. So I made the decision to move for training. But I think that there's inevitably, and benefit of hindsight, I don't know why I didn't really think about this, but there is something uprooting about moving cities and then also starting what I found to be an academically challenging, emotionally challenging, physically challenging at times program. All of those things together, I think, have been incredibly draining at times. But there have also been, really positives, I think, to meeting other people, hearing about their experiences, their incredibly varied experiences, pre-training, but also throughout training, has been really enriching. And I guess I hadn't really anticipated that, the social aspect of meeting 30 other people who, each bring something different to the programme and to my experience of the programme. I think that with that being said, I struggled in first year, I think, with finding my voice within a cohort, which I appreciate different programmes have even bigger course sizes than mine. But there's something about, I think, in first year where there's so much newness and people are really trying to find their feet. And I think there's a bit of a dance of people trying to prove themselves, like, oh yeah, I've got loads of experience in this area, or I've got loads of experience in this area. And it's not necessarily conscious. But I think that in my cohort, and it's something that I myself, I'm sure, was definitely involved in this, there was a bit of, I guess, people really wanting to prove themselves, because you have that kind of imposter syndrome of, am I really here? Have I really got a place? After hearing how competitive it is, and is that place going to be taken away? Like, all of those anxieties play out. And I think that often a response to that is to kind of, try and prove yourself. And it's a bit of covert competition, I think, among cohorts. That's something that I experienced. And then I think finding it hard to find myself, to find my voice as a woman, as a young Black woman as well, and thinking about those layers of my identity and how they maybe came to the forefront of my mind more so during training than they had perhaps when I was working, pre-training, or perhaps in kind of social settings. So I think that, for many reasons, the experience of training has kind of, I think of it as it's almost like broken me apart a little bit. And then I've kind of been putting myself back together, which sounds really dramatic, but I think there's something about, the process of training where you maybe have to engage with things that you haven't thought about before, which I think is actually really helpful because it's something that we maybe ask our clients to do in therapy and perhaps are not necessarily used to doing ourselves. But I don't think that was a process that I was anticipating. I do also think that the journey and experience of training has changed over the course of the 3 years. So now that I'm in third year, I look back at some of my early experiences and just realise that, I'm a slightly different person for those experiences, and how I would approach those experiences now is different. I think where first year was the time of newness, it was also a time of excitement. That idea of, am I really here and I've done it, and us all just being like really buoyed with enthusiasm. And then second year was a time of just like, oh my gosh, like the enthusiasm of first year has kind of waned, but the end in sight of qualifying feels quite far off. So I felt a bit like I was treading water. And then now in third year, I feel like the end is in sight, and the last 2.5 years have gone so incredibly quickly. I'm not sure that I'm ready to qualify in less than a year's time. But I'm also kind of ready to have more time to do my own thing and not spend evenings and weekends studying. So I think that's the slight downside of training, which I'm sure people are already aware of, but juggling teaching, assignments, placement, thesis, as well as your kind of social and family relationships, the things that are important to you, your hobbies, your interests, and then your own kind of physical and mental health. I think that has been exhausting and incredibly challenging at times. But never throughout this process, I think, have I questioned my decision to apply and to accept my place. I just think it's maybe been a bit more of an emotional roller coaster than I had anticipated. So I guess I share that just to say to other people who maybe, like me, naively thought applying was the hard part, that you still do have 3 years of hard work at the end of it all, but 3 years I found of incredibly valuable and enjoyable work at times. I think related to my experiences of training, there have definitely been times where I've sat there in lectures or on placement and thought about, actually, is this me as a trainee? Is this me as a woman? Is this me as a Black woman? Is this kind of a mix of all of those identities? So I think, and I think being in London as well, there is something about being a Black woman training as a clinical psychologist here in London that also brings up things. I remember at my interview, looking around and being really pleasantly surprised to see so many Black women, and also a few Black men who were interviewing for UEL. And I remember at that time wondering, why does that make me feel happy, proud, warm, all of those things? And it was because I had never seen that before. So I grew up in a very white city. I went to university in a very white city, and to then come to London and see other people that looked like me, applying, interested in psychology, I think massively has influenced my training journey. I think to bear in mind that I had never met a Black psychologist before I moved to London. And even now, I think I only know maybe of 4 qualified Black clinical psychologists. I've never seen a Black client until I moved to London. And that just fascinates me for so many reasons, because although the cities that I lived in before London were majority white, of course there were still Black people there were still Asian people there were still people from mixed heritage and other minority ethnic backgrounds, and yet they weren't being seen in services, or at least I wasn't seeing them in the services that I worked in. And I think the further on I get in my journey of training, the more I think about that and the more I question why that is. And I guess there's often this idea of stigma in Black, Asian, mixed heritage, minority ethnic communities. And I think that that's a relevant factor to consider, but I don't think it's the full picture. And I think that often as psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, we kind of push back and say, such and such Black man, he doesn't want to come to therapy because he's the stigma, he's worried about what his friends' family are going to think. And I think that actually does a disservice to those communities, and actually it's maybe a way of psychology protecting itself and not reflecting on our own issues. So the fact that our services aren't accessible to people from Black, Asian, mixed heritage, minority ethnic backgrounds, they're not accessible to many people from many diverse backgrounds. And that, I think when I think about that, that makes me maybe question my decision and wonder if, training as a clinical psychologist, I'm actually part of the problem, part of the issue of institutional racism within psychology. And actually, is that a system that I can change from within, or is it something that maybe I should have made a decision to work out with? I think those are the kind of things that I think about, that I imagine are unique to me as a Black person. I don't imagine that my white peers in my cohort are thinking about that. And so I guess I'm conscious of what I perceive as this additional burden. When I go into my placement, when I go into my lectures, I'm not just going in as a trainee. And that's not to say that other people don't have kind of individual demographics and layers that they are engaging with. But in my cohort of 31 people, there are only 3 people who are Black. In the year that I started training, 2016, 581 trainee clinical psychologists were accepted across the country, and of those 581, only 10 identify as Black. Those figures are kind of what I carry with me, and I'm aware that although kind of at the stage of interview, I was really enthusiastic to see what felt like so many Black people around me, the reality is that now that I am training, there are only 9 other Black people across the country who are training in the same year as me, and that just feels bizarre. And I think that that's why I'm so invested in doing things both within my course and out with my course, like this interview, because it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. And I think that there are so many different ideas, the idea of stigma, the idea that I've heard people talking about Black aspiring psychologists not being reflective enough, whatever that means, or saying that, we're not attaining the same grades, we're not attaining the same skills. And again, I think like the argument of stigma, it kind of just positions the issue within Black aspiring psychologists and ignores the fact that actually the institution of psychology, like psychiatry, like many, mental health institutions, is institutionally racist, and it's not a space that is necessarily encouraging or welcoming of people who are not from this kind of dominant position of whiteness. And I think, maybe in reflecting on the challenges and why I found it at times so emotionally and physically draining, maybe that it's part of that as well, like being in a position that you don't necessarily feel is welcoming to you, and holding that and knowing that that's maybe not something that your peers have to contend with. I think that's been a challenge. I would advise my 16-year-old self to enjoy the process. Looking back, I was in so much of a rush to do this training thing, and I think that links back to people telling me how competitive it is. So I was just really, really working to make sure that I was getting relevant experience, that I was developing relevant skills. And now when I look back and think about, it's not so much that I missed out on things. I think that I did actually manage the work-life balance thing relatively well, but just, I don't know, have fun, go traveling, do other jobs that aren't psychology related, develop yourself as a person beyond your career. I think that is so important, because actually what you bring to the room when you're seeing somebody therapeutically, working with somebody as a psychologist, I think is so much more than your psychological and therapeutic skills. You're bringing your personality, and if your personality is so much focused on who you are, I think even, introducing myself and saying, I'm Cassie, I'm a third-year trainee clinical psychologist, that's something that I often feel reluctant to do, because yes, that is who I am in terms of professional sense, but I like to think that I have a lot more to offer outside of that. So I think that's advice that I'd give to my younger self, and also advice that I try and hold now, is to have things that matter to you outside of work, because that's important too. Essentially, clinical psychology is something that I really enjoy. It's something that I'm really passionate about, but it is a job. It's something that I get paid to do, and that, being paid then means that I can do other things that I really enjoy in my life. So I think keeping that work-life balance, not being in such a hurry to get things done and to achieve things, but actually just enjoying the process, I think is helpful to consider. I think linked in with advice to my 16-year-old self about not rushing the process, enjoying the journey, I think the advice that I would give to my future clinical psychologist self is to stay true to my values. I think that training as a clinical psychologist is important to me because of the values that I hold in working with people particularly who are from perhaps traditionally marginalised and oppressed backgrounds. There's something about social justice, which I know is such an overused term, particularly at the moment, and activism, and all of those values are what has brought me to this career. But on those stressful and overwhelming days, it's easy to just lose sight of that and become almost robotic and going through the motions and just kind of getting things done, rather than actually feeling the feelings that are involved in hearing incredibly distressing stories that people might bring and actually engaging with that. So I hope that throughout my career, I can still keep that humanity, I can still keep hold of those values and that passion and that motivation and that commitment to activism and social justice that have brought me here, and not get bogged down in, I guess, the stress of the role and lose sight of who I am. So I really hope that I'm able to do that. It'll be interesting, perhaps in a few years' time, to watch this video back and see, maybe hold myself accountable if I am losing my way and losing sight of those values.